Well, good morning, class. Mr. Gomez again. I hope everybody is well. I hope you are following all the instructions, keeping social distance. Here's a shout out to Miss Nieves, Miss Abreu, Miss Robles, Miss Zumba. Also, a shout out to Mr. Sutton. And Mr. McCune, I want you to get on and look at these lectures and do the work. Okay? I hope everybody is doing well. Daniel, both Daniels, and Miss Scott. I hope that everyone is safe and healthy. Okay, so today we're going to do Marxism. The theories of Karl Marx, which were very, very influential into the 19th and 20th century. Karl Marx is the father of Marxist socialism and communism. And in 1849, he published a classic work, the Communist Manifesto, during the revolutions that swept Europe and globally had a tremendous influence. In 1848, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and it became the first statement of his ideology. He would later write Das Kapital in 1867, which is a much more detailed and some would say obtruse, or at least hard to read, detailed version of communist ideology. He wrote with Friedrich Engels. Engels was a German thinker. He was the son of a factory owner, a man who owned factories in England. And he collaborated with Karl Marx, who was a journalist, in the writings that I just mentioned, the Communist Manifesto in 1849 and Das Kapital in 1867. Karl Marx despised the utopian socialists. He despised the romantic view that capitalism could be regulated, could be fixed in order to be more amenable to the needs of the working class. Marx believed that capitalism had to be ultimately destroyed, and he worked from the premise that was established by Rousseau, that all private property was theft. And he developed a view of history that said that ultimately what would happen was that the proletariat, the industrial working class, and proletariat is the word we're going to use for the industrial working class, would carry out a revolution that would eventually eliminate private property and would eliminate private ownership over the means of production. And that this was determined by the struggle between classes throughout history. Marx had three very, very important ideas. The first of these ideas he got by studying under George Wilhelm Hegel. Hegel was a major philosopher, major German philosopher of the early 19th century. He followed Kant, and he was the next most important philosopher in the German idealist tradition. Hegel basically said that history moved forward towards its fulfillment, which he said history was God fulfilling himself, coming to know himself throughout history, and the process that led that to happen was what he called the dialectic, or at least has been interpreted as the dialectic. That is, that ideas struggle against each other to produce a final comprehensive concept, and that influences the development of history throughout time, moving history forward. And there is something of the Whig view of history, that is, that history is progressing towards greater and greater freedom, and therefore history is fulfilling itself in human freedom. And Hegel argued that ideas struggled against each other. First, there was the thesis, the principal idea that dominated a certain period of history. That was challenged by the antithesis. And in that struggle between ideas, that a synthesis, something new, would be created, and that would lead to a new stage in history where the synthesis was dominant. Marx studied under Hegel, but he rejected Hegel. He was a member of the young Hegelians, people like Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer, who rejected religion, rejected mysticism, rejected the sense that of Hegel, that ideas had a life of their own, an independent life of their own. Marx basically said that he had stood Hegel, or it was said of Marx that he stood Hegel on his head, because Marx rejected the idea that concepts struggled against each other, and that was forcing history forward. Marx replaced the ideas of Hegel with materialism. So his principal idea is known as historical materialism or historical determinism. Marx believed that it was a material struggle, socio-economic struggle between classes that drove history forward. He believed that different classes dominated different periods of history by having control over the means of production. So earlier on, those groups that had control over the land dominated that period, which he called the feudal period. Feudalism was based on wealth derived from land ownership. And whoever owned the land set up the rules for everything. The rules for economics, politics, the law, gender relationships, social relationships were all determined by that class, and they were set up in order to protect the right or the power of that group over the means of production. So everything that exists in society is the byproduct of whoever owns the means of production. And they set up rules in their own benefit to guarantee the continuation of their control over the means of production. But Marx says that in each period, and he divides history into what he calls the slave period, that is where everything, all the means of production, all the land belonged to one man, and therefore you have the Pharaoh in Egypt, the emperor in Rome, and that religions that set up these figures as godlike were set up in order to protect their control over the means of production. But when economic conditions began to change and the economic systems that were established under these individuals who controlled all the land failed to produce enough and impoverished enough people, alienated enough people, those people would rise up in a new struggle, overthrow the system, and set up their own economic and social structure. And Marx said that the slave economy went over to the feudal economy, where you had the king, you had knights, you had men-at-arms, you had serfs, you had peasants, serfs, and slaves, and all that was set up in order to preserve the control of the feudal elites over the means of production. That is, the control of the means of production by the feudal elites. And religion, Christianity was established to do that. The relationships between men and women were established to do that. The economic ritual, the social rituals that held together the economic system were established to do that. And Marx said that this happened at the fall of the Roman Empire. Then you had the feudal system, and that lasted until the French Revolution. And Marx says that the feudal system ceased to produce enough to satisfy a large enough group, which he calls the bourgeoisie. These were the commercial merchants that were developing new economic systems that challenged the feudal structure. And the bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie is what he calls this group, rose up eventually and overthrew the feudal system and established a system that guaranteed the bourgeoisie's control of the means of production and established capitalism. Marx says that capitalism swept away all the mysticism, all the concepts of feudalism, to establish a system that was primarily based on the exploitation of the working classes. And that once industrialization takes place, that you have an industrial working class, which he calls the proletariat, and that class will eventually be alienated by capitalist exploitation and will rise up, and that will lead to the Proletariat Revolution. Now, Marx gets you there. He doesn't really explain what happens afterwards. What has happened historically is that you've had dictatorships take over. They've eliminated private property. They've established authoritarian or totalitarian systems. But Marx never really explored what would happen after the revolution. So there is some question as in terms of what Marx expected to happen. Marx did say that for a short period of time there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to guarantee that the bourgeoisie wouldn't come back to power. But beyond that, he doesn't say. But Marx does say that these stages of history have to happen, and they all have to happen consequentially. That is, they must all take place one after the other. You cannot skip any period in history, and therefore all these stages must happen before you get to the Proletariat Revolution at the end. And that is Marx's concept of historical determinism or historical materialism. It is one of three very important Marxist concepts. The second concept is the iron laws of wages. Marx believes that capitalism is set up to maximize profits and therefore must keep workers' wages very, very low. Marx says that this alienates the workers because it basically just provides for subsistence wages for workers, nothing else, in order to maximize profits. And that this leads to an alienation of the workers. The workers are gain a revolutionary consciousness against capitalism because of this, and they eventually rise up. Marx says that this has to take place because capitalism is essentially based on maximizing profits, and in order to maximize profits, you have to keep wages very low. That is the second major law of Marxism. So you have historical determinism or historical materialism. You have the iron laws of wages, and then the third one that Marx establishes is the concept of the labor theory of value. Unlike Adam Smith, who says that scarcity and the laws of supply and demand create the value of a thing, Marx says that the amount of work that workers put into a product or producing a product is what gives that product its value. And since the workers are putting most of the value into the thing, when capitalists sell that product and they keep most of the profits, they are stealing from the workers. The workers begin to realize that, and they are further alienated from their labor by capitalism, and eventually they gain this revolutionary consciousness and eventually rise up when conditions become unbearable. And that is the third law of Marxism, the iron laws of wages. So Marx sets up this a very detailed system of alienation, historical determinism, to argue that there must be, that history is moving towards the Proletariat Revolution. After that, Marx really doesn't say what will happen. Marx has had tremendous influence. He is seen as the prototype for most socialists. So socialists generally believe that history will lead to a stage which is known as communism. So you have to think of socialism as the train that gets you there, and communism is the last station where you want to arrive. Well, once you get to communism, there will be no private property. No one will own anything. The state will disappear, according to Marx. Well, that hasn't happened. But and that everyone will have enough for what they need, because people will produce on the basis of their ability to the highest level. That has never happened in a communist state. Communist state generally do level economic production to the point where you have large-scale poverty throughout society. And that's what's happened historically, and that's been imposed, or at least maintained, by totalitarian states that use violence to control opposition. Marx has also been altered by different thinkers. Lenin, for example, who led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, changed Marxism to Marxism Leninism. Lenin said that Russia wasn't really at the capitalist stage. Russia was primarily a feudal society. Lenin argued that Russia could bypass the capitalist stage if the working class accepted the leadership of a professional revolutionary party that would give the working class a revolutionary consciousness, make them aware of their exploitation before it had been made aware of that by the actual exploitation of capitalism, and would be led in the revolutionary struggle by this revolutionary party that he called the vanguard of the proletariat. The bypassing of the capitalist stage and the whole concept of a revolutionary party as the vanguard of the proletariat was the change that Lenin made to Marxism. So if communists argued that, they would be known later on as Marxist-Leninists. But that basically follows much later than Marx. Marx died in 1881. Lenin led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia. There have been other socialists, people like Edward Bernstein, who believed in evolutionary socialism. He believed that you can get to communism through democratic processes. Bernstein was criticized by revolutionary Marxists as being a defeatist. And then Mao in China argued for a peasant revolution, which was much closer to the anarchist idea of agrarian radicalism that Marx said. Marx completely rejected. Marx believed the peasants were essentially a conservative group that would support conservative movement's conservative leadership. Okay, I am going to stop now, but I like you, everyone, to do basically a small paragraph on whether you think, given what you know of socialism, whether you think that Bernie Sanders is a socialist or is he a utilitarian, active state liberal. I want you to give me at least a couple of lines explaining why you think that. Okay, so please put that on Edmodo and you will get a grade for it. Again, I hope everyone is doing well, and I will be getting back on Monday. So you have until Tuesday to do this assignment. Okay, bye.